God bless everyone. So glad that you're here. It's a delight for me and a pleasure to share God's word with you. And we continue in Exodus. Last week we didn't get through the whole chapter of Exodus 20. Had a little technical problem with the internet, but we did get through the first 17 verses. So we're going to continue on tonight. And just a little bit of last week, Israel was commanded to sanctify themselves. God told Moses to tell the people to sanctify themselves because in 3 days he's going to be on the mountain. And so they were preparing for that because the third day God would speak. Then we saw God in the word descend upon Mount Sinai. And let me show you a quick picture here. Let me open this up. There they are. And I'll share. And of course, everybody's familiar with how sharing goes with this computer. Uh, there it is. And I'll get rid of the gray here in a minute. Okay. Should be popping up any second. There it is. You guys see any gray?
No, looks good, except, yeah, perfect.
Excellent. Well, I did do some disk cleaning this week, so maybe that helped. But anyhow, here we have um, the journey of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. As we know, they came out of the land of Goshen, which is there on the west side of the Nile Delta, very fertile, rich land. They had lots of sheep and livestock there. And then after the plagues, they were released and headed out. And they came down this path. And then they crossed over the Red Sea at a narrow point in here. And as we know, that cloud of fire was there, and the Egyptian army decided they wanted them to come back, and so they attacked. And Moses parted the Red Sea. They passed on through there, and then closed it up on top of the army, and then they headed south. Now they could have headed up here, been a closer route, but this is a route God wanted because He wanted to bring them away from everything and so they could worship him. That was the big deal they kept telling Pharaoh, so they can come and worship me in my mountain. So they finally make it down to God's mountain here, and you might be able to see it better. But this is where it's believed to be Mount Sinai. Now, I have seen people put it over here, but this really seems to make the most sense. So they're taking this long route. Of course, we know it's going to end up taking them 40 years, and we're going to find out why God wanted it to take 40 years when it should have only taken a few weeks or a month or so. But there was some trouble there within Israel that God had to deal with, and it took time to deal with it. So here they are at Mount Sinai. It's also called Mount Horeb. And we'll go back. So so tonight we're going to continue in Exodus 17, and we're going to go into chapter 21. And this section here concludes the Ten Commandments. And now we're going to move into ordinances and things like that. But the last one here of the Ten Commandments was do not covet your neighbor's house, do not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, nor female servant, nor his ox, donkey, or anything else that's your neighbor. So before I talk about that, we're going to talk about these verses here. In Exodus 20, verse 1 through 16, this is where we saw that God audibly spoke the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. And the commentary points out that this was not when Moses came down later with the tablets. That won't be until Exodus 32. That was over a month afterward. And of course, we've all seen the movie with Charlton Heston. And it gives the impression when he comes down the mountain with those tablets that that's the first time they ever heard of it. Because if you remember in the movie, he speaks it as he's writing the Ten Commandments up on the top. But that's not what happened. We know that he told Moses to have the people come near the mountain but not touch it. And so he's giving the words. This first giving was spoken directly by God, and it was heard by all of Israel. And this was done between the third and fourth trip up Mount Sinai. Now, the first four commandments focused on loving and honoring God. First one was have no other gods. Second, do not make carved images. Third, do not misuse the name of Yahweh. And the fourth was remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And we went into detail on all of that last week. Then the next six commandments are about loving others. The first four are about loving and honoring God. And then 5 through 10 are about loving others. Starts out with number 5. Honor your father and mother. And this is the first commandment with promise that it will be well with you upon the earth and your days will be long. And then 6, King James says, do not kill. It's really do not murder. There's a huge difference. And we went into that. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false witness. And the last one, do not covenant. And the covenant part is kind of a thing where it leads into these other sins. So these commandments establish a moral foundation for Israel and actually for all of humanity. You still see them in courtrooms today. You see them in my granddaughter's above her bed in her room. So her parents can teach her the 10 commandments. And they're very important. And so Exodus 20:17 is where we're going to begin tonight. And that's where we left off. And I just read that one. So we're going to go into 18. All the people saw the thunderings. That's a figure. You don't really see thundering, but you see the lightning and the sound of the shofar, which we know is that horn, right? Let me show you real quick. I think I can pull that up really quick. There it is. There's a person with a shofar. It's a big ram's horn. And when we were in the Bible lands, we heard those, and you can hear them pretty easy. If you want to look them up on the internet, there they are. It's no trouble finding them and hearing them. And so there was that sound of shofar, and they trembled and they stood afar off. And actually, they backed up some. And they said to Moses in verse 19, you speak with us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we'll die. So they were pretty shook up about this thing. I don't know why they thought they would die, but it must have been very terrifying to hear this loud voice coming out of the mountain. And God honored their request. So in the next verse, it's kind of a tragic but revealing moment. Israel preferred a human go between rather than the direct presence of God. So that's what they chose. They wanted Moses to act as a mediator, and God honored that. So Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come to test you so that the fear of him will be upon you and so that you will not sin. So that'd be a pretty dramatic situation. A mountain shaking, thundering, lightning, smoke, huge voice, shofars. I think that would cause some fear in the good sense. Now, the fear of God it's kind of like a deep reverence. It's not a terror, but it is kind of mixed with fear. It's kind of like, lightning's powerful, and there it is over there in the outlet over there. And if I stick a fork in there, I can probably get myself shocked pretty bad. So, I know that's dangerous, and God is dangerous in the sense that he's all powerful, not that he's going to be mean to you, but I've always had a little bit of trouble getting the right mindset on that, but I think I'm getting a little bit closer on what it means to fear God. And I've actually prayed for that. And I think that's a good prayer. Teach me what it means to fear you in the way you want to be feared. So in verse 21, so the people stood at a distance, there were no problem. We're not going to touch the mountain. That was a law. If you touch the mountain, it was going to be bad news. So they stood back. But Moses is fearless and he draws near God, this thick darkness where God was in verse 21. So it's not God's purpose wasn't to try to frighten people, his people away, but to keep them from sinning. Because when you think about it, reverence and awe will produce obedience. And that was what he's after. And he still is after obedience. So Moses drew near that thick darkness. And this is a very beautiful picture of trust, uh, moving toward what others were afraid of. In verse 22, Yahweh said to Moses, "This is what you are to say to the children of Israel." Okay, so he would have said it personally himself, but they asked him not to. So he's honoring the request. So the next thing that comes from God goes directly to Moses, just like they had requested. This is what I want you to say to the children of Israel. He could caveat there and say, because they don't want me talking to them directly. He didn't put that part, but that's the truth. You yourselves have seen that I have spoken with you from heaven. So you can't deny that I already did that. Now he's going to go into it. You shall not make gods of silver or gold or gods of gold to be alongside me. You shall make an altar. So he doesn't want the gods, but what he does want is he wants an altar of earth. And altar actually means slaughter. It's, when we think of altars in a church, they're all pretty, have candles on them and stuff like that. But the true meaning of altar is a place of slaughter. It was not a clean, wonderful, beautiful place. And so he wanted them to make an altar of earth. Now, earth includes stones, right? And they didn't have shovels and pitchforks and all that stuff. So he wanted an altar. So they made it, they took the stones and they probably put some soil in it to stabilize them and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your cattle. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and I will bless you. So we know that this sacrificing was a temporary forgiveness of sins, right? This was pointing to the ultimate perfect sacrifice for sin, which would be in the future, which was foretold to Adam and Eve way back in the garden. So this is that in between thing that can be done and should be done, needs to be done while they were waiting for the Messiah. You're to make me an altar of stones. You must not build it of cut stones. He didn't want them making pretty stones, cutting them out or anything like that, because if you lift up your tool on it, you've defiled it. He wanted it natural. Like, I know this is, that's the way he wanted it. This is where we're at now. This is well after the flood. And so there were stones in the earth and they were natural, they were uncut. That's what he wanted. You must not go up by steps. He didn't want them to walk, didn't have steps. And if you look at the pictures and if you look at the description in the Bible, the altar in the tabernacle and in that tent of meetings that they carried around here before too long, and the main temple when it was first built by Solomon had an altar and they had a ramp. They didn't have steps to go up there. So that your nakedness is not exposed on it. And that's interesting. God's always concerned about that proper dress, being modest and not showing any nakedness. And this is kind of interesting. These are open air altars, kind of like what we saw with Abraham. And they were to use these stones. And what God wanted, he himself was made natural, unadorned stone. And it says that this nakedness would not be exposed. This reflects the modesty and reverence that completely opposite to pagan religions, where priests often performed rituals unclothed. But God's worship was to be pure, honorable, and set apart. I don't understand the fullness of this. I don't know why steps expose nakedness where a ramp doesn't. I'm sure there's some more depth of reasoning there. I just don't know what it is. But we'll take it for what he said. He doesn't like, he wants things to be done the way they should be done. Now we move on to Exodus 21. Now, these are the ordinances. We've been talking about commandments, right? But these are the ordinances that you are to set before them. See, Moses, God is still talking to Moses. He could have done this directly to the children, but they didn't want that. So now let's talk about that a little bit. With the Ten Commandments complete, which we've just completed all 10, God begins with these ordinances. Now, these are going to be more specific applications for moral law and daily life. And I think you're going to find these very interesting. I did when I first read them. And I've read them more than once because they're very beautifully done. And you get to see how God thinks. And we'll just get into it. And we'll see how he's so wise. And if we will follow those things even today, that'd be so much better. So if you buy a Hebrew slave, what? Doesn't that catch you right away? Buying Hebrew slaves? Well, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh year, he shall go out free without paying anything. So right after commanding freedom and justice, God regulates slavery. Well, why is that? Well, Israel just come out of slavery, right? And God wanted them to understand that even servitude must respect human dignity. So he handles this right off the bat. Now, why would a person buy a Hebrew slave? What would happen, and we're going to see more of this, that if a person couldn't pay a debt, it wasn't like they just went bankrupt and so sorry. They had to come through. God is a God of reciprocation. When someone doesn't take, and he's all about personal accountability. So it's just not okay, and we just blow it off, or we go bankrupt, or depending on the severity, maybe there's something kind of incarceration. So what would happen if a parent couldn't pay a debt? He had the option to sell himself into slavery, which would pay off the debt, or to even sell a child. And we think, how horrible. Because whenever we think of slavery, we think about the chattel system, the American black slavery, or we think about the children of Israel when they were slaves under the Pharaoh. God's slavery is totally different, and we're going to see how it goes. So the maximum he can serve is 6 years. If you say, I owe you $10,000, he serves 6 years if he can't pay it. If I owe you 250 and he can't pay it, he serves 6 years. The punishment's the same. You never see, well, 2 years here, 4 years here, 8 years there. It's 6 years. And at the end of the 6 years, on the seventh, he's to go free. That's it. I'm done. But it's also interesting, too, about this, and we're going to look at it a little bit further. Hebrew slavery was not ownership. Now, in America, the slaves, they purchased slaves so that they owned the slaves. They didn't purchase them to pay a debt. They owned them, and they were theirs until the day they died. They had children, they fed them, they made them work. Some of the slaves were mean, some of them were good. And so we see that in the ancient world as well. In Rome and other places, there were really slaves, and that was not something that you desired. But here God has some rules. So say, for instance, this guy comes in as a slave. He comes in by himself, and he is to go out by himself. If he's married, then his wife is to go out with him. Okay, so you got two situations. He goes into slavery as a single man. Well, he leaves by himself if he came in as a single man. But if he came in married and brought his wife, then they go out together. And that makes sense, right? If his master gives him a wife, now we got a different situation. It's different. And it's, okay, let me go on and I'll come back and fill in some blanks here. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him, the slave, sons or daughters, the wife and her children will be the master's, and he must go out by himself. And you think, wow, that's not very nice, But really, let's think about it. It seems harsh by our standards, but it reflects personal responsibility. Well, let's think about it. The master had provided housing, food, and support for that family. So if he gave this man a wife, there's costs involved. And if he has to support the wife as well, right? He buys the food, clothing, all this stuff. And then if they have children, all that is not free. So what we're seeing, it reflects personal responsibility. The servant could choose. He's got a couple of choices. One, he could say, I'm not getting married while I'm a slave because I don't want to leave my wife and kids behind. Or he could say, yeah, I'm going to get married while I'm a slave and I'm going to permanently remain a slave. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you see how there's personal accountability here. And he thinks about the slave owner who has to cover costs, and he thinks about the slave and his consequences, his decisions. He got into the situation probably because of some bad decisions, maybe not. So you see God always expecting personal accountability. So verse 5. But if the slave says yes, says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free. Then the master is to bring him to the judges and will bring him to the door or to the doorpost. And the master is, if he accepts that, he is to bore his ear through with an awl. It's kind of like a heavy duty piercing. It's not like a little pin went through your earlobe. It's an awl. And I've seen people today have larger piercings in the bottom. And I think about that. I know that they're not somebody who's somebody's slave now, but that's what they did. Now you might think, well, bring him to the door or the doorpost. That's kind of interesting. So it's first of all, eventually there is going to be a door in the tabernacle. The tabernacle's not up yet. And then later on, God was one of these ordinances to continue that even in Israel, and when they would have before the temple made, they would have cities where Levites would live, and they could go to that city and they could go to those to get a judgment. So if he wanted to be a permanent slave, he would go and before the judges, so there'd be witnesses and agreement, and then they put that hole in his ear, and so with an awl, and he will serve forever. Now you see the word forever in quotation marks. It was a lifelong commitment, but later on we'll see that forever would have meant until the year of Jubilee. Now we're not going to go into the year of Jubilee. You probably heard of it, but Leviticus 25, verse 39 through 41, you can read about that. And at that time, these slaves were set free. And the year of Jubilee, I believe, was like every 50 years. So the guy would be a slave until either the year of Jubilee or when else would his term expire? You might have a guess.
Yeah, death.
Yes. When the master died, he was free. So if somebody wants to stay in that servitude, it's kind of interesting. Some people aren't good with stewarding their money. And sometimes would say, I kind of like this. I get food, I get housing, I get clothing, I got wife, I got kids. Everybody's fed, everybody's cared for. The master is good. I think I'll stay here because the last time I went out on my own, I just made a mess of it. And so it's not a bad deal. And when you got loving situations like that, I can see where they'd want to do it. Now, I think it's in my notes here, but I don't see it. In my one set of notes, I had it, but I don't see it now. But I wanted to let you know that when they let the slave go in that 7th year, they didn't say goodbye. You're on your own. They loaded him down. They gave him supplies. They gave him food. They gave him whatever he needed so he could continue his life as a free person. What happens if you throw somebody, like when they get out of prison? I used to work with the reintegration center, and you had teenagers who had no parental support, and they had no financial support. So they're in juvie or jail or prison, and then they get out. They have no money. What happens when you put them back on the streets? They go right back to what they did. And so what the master would do is he'd help this person get on their feet, give them what they needed, so they wouldn't be in this endless cycle of coming back into it. So we see how different the Hebrew servanthood was from slavery in Egypt or modern history. It was relational, and it was chosen, and it was often desirable. So let's continue here in verse 7. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. Oh, what? That doesn't sound fair. But it is. You got to think about it. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, there's more depth to it. She is being sold into that household to be a wife. It's either going to be the wife of the master or maybe someone in his family. So that's why she would stay, because it's not going to be you just live around here for a few years, for the 6 years, and then go. And you can see how that's an open door for some problems. So it always meant that girl, that woman, would become the wife of the master or the wife in his household. Now, if she's unpleasant in his eye, the eyes of her master. Now, that's kind of a unique way of saying it. If she doesn't please her master, so he has betrothed her, they're married, they're going to be together. If he doesn't like her, maybe he has another wife and he loves this wife less and he wants to get rid of her. He didn't throw it on the street. She must be redeemed. Now, the redemption means that her family can purchase her back. They can make some agreement. Say she was with them so many years. They say, we'll give you such and so, and we want her back. Or somebody else in a different Israelite. As we're going to see, they are not to be sold to someone outside, a foreigner. So if he, and let's continue here, he will have no right. He must sell her, must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken the commitment with her. So this, you can see why this slave person is not just a slave, but it's actually a wife, and he's breaking a commitment. So if he wants to do that, he can, but he needs to sell her back to her family or some other Israelite. And well, you know the story about that. And I can't remember their names right now, but we know the story about that, the kinsman redeemer story in the Bible that comes up later.
Ruth.
Ruth, there we go. Thank you. I think that's right. Yeah. Okay. So if he designates her for his son, he must deal with her according to the rights of daughters. Now let's take a look at this. This is verse 9. All right. So he must deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife, he will not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. That's in verse 10. So what we see here is that if her son, as I mentioned earlier, it could be that this person would become a wife of the son. He must deal with her according to her rights of daughters. And these here, we're going to go over the rights. If he takes another wife to himself, so that means he's got at least two now, he must not hold back her food. So he must deal with her in a way that respects her. So just because he doesn't unpleasant in his eyes, he still has to provide her food. Now, the commentary shows that clothing here, we got food, clothing, and conjugal rights. These are three interesting things, and we're going to unpack that. Now, food doesn't mean the scraps that nobody wants or the vegetables. This means that she should be well fed, just like the other wife. No secondary situation in her clothing. She needs to have the clothing that she needs. And in ancient times, clothing was also shelter. If you were poor, you would sleep outside and you needed your clothing. Later on, we're going to read where if a man gives his cloak as a promise to pay back something, the person who took his cloak has to give it back to him at night, so he has something to sleep under. And he says, if you don't, I'm going to hear his crying and I'm going to come back at you, the person who took it as a promissory thing, and then give it back. So God sees clothing as more than just clothing. It's also shelter and her conjugal rights. Now, this is interesting. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The conjugal rights are, of course, we're talking about sexual intercourse. Now, why is this pointed out here? And we know this, and you'll recall this, in the ancient world, they did not have Social Security. When people got old, they relied on their children to care for them. If they had no children, it was considered a curse because they would be left to prostitution and premature death because no one would take care of them. And then it could be pretty rough. Sometimes if they didn't have men around them, other men would come and take them and treat them badly. So the conjugal rights would allow the woman to bear children. And then if she had children, and normally it took at least 5 children in that culture because so many of them would not make it to full adulthood, so that was their Social Security. And so this was God, he saw that, and that's the way their life was. That's how the aged were taken care of, by their children. And so he must not deny her that. So he has to have the conjugal visits, the rights, the intercourse, so that she can bear children and care for herself. So her children will care for her down the road. Now, this is kind of interesting. If he does not do these 3 things for her, she can go free without paying any money. And this is kind of interesting too. This is going to be developed later. But this is actually gives the woman the right for a divorce. We see so much throughout the Bible, adultery and men divorcing women, but you hear very little about women divorcing men. These are the grounds for a woman to divorce a man. It's not brought up much. It's just kind of glossed over. But the husband is required to give her good food, clothing, and shelter, and allow her to have children. And if he doesn't, she can just head out the door without paying any money. So the law gave women real recourse. She could leave freely if neglected. It balanced authority with responsibility. So you see the husband having authority and responsibility. And it showed that covenant love, or this love in the marriage, isn't one-sided. It has to be from the husband and to the wife. So we're not going to go any farther today, but I have a few things just to kind of for takeaways and summarizing. God's voice calls for reverence and obedience. Like Israel at Sinai, we are invited to his presence with awe and not fear that drives us away, but reverence that draws us closer to God and, of course, now Christ. God's laws reveals his heart for justice and mercy. The ordinances remind us that holiness is practical. It shapes how we treat people, how we handle responsibility, and seek fairness. True freedom includes responsibility. Whether in work, relationships, or spiritual life, God's design always joins liberty with accountability. Servants, masters, parents, children alike were called to reflect his character in their actions. Now, next week, Lord willing, we're going to get into, as you can see there, that first verse. If anyone strikes a person so that he dies, must be put to death. But we're going to get into the different laws. If an ox is killed, if a sheep is killed, if a woman miscarriages because she was struck, if there's a hole in the ground and some animal falls into it. Now, these all seem like ancient types of things, but these can all be brought forward into our modern life with a little bit of thought. And we're going to see that God is about personal accountability and fair reciprocation. If you stole something in the Old Testament, you just didn't say, okay, you had to give it back more than what you stole. It wasn't enough just to give back, but you stole. And we're going to see this. You had to give more. And if you couldn't pay it, you went into servitude. Today we have prisons. And in prisons, what you see is people are told what to do, what to eat, what to wear. And it's really a sense of a slavery situation. And what happens, it's not just for 6 years. It can be for a lifetime. And then guess what else? There's no reciprocation. And usually there's no restoration or because people come out, sometimes they're worse than they went in. And then we get to pay for it. Your tax dollars gets to pay for those prisons. But back here, they had no prisons. They had no police. And this is how they dealt with their society in a way that was fair. It was honest. It required accountability. And it showed justice and love on all the parties involved. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for revealing your justice, your love, how you look at things, how you deal with things, and all the things that you do to promise us what we need and to gives us the things we need to now have a godly society, that we can incorporate these thought patterns, even though our governments don't allow this type of stuff to go on. We can see how you originally set it up and how you wanted it done. And it's far superior to what we're dealing with now, I think. But it takes some time to adjust to this. It's a different way of thinking, but your ways are much higher than our ways. So instead of bringing you down to our kind of thinking, we want to move our mental capacity up and try to match you. And if it takes a little while to understand it, we pray about it, we read it again, and we think about it. And if there's ever a problem, you said in your word, come sit down with me and reason with me. You're a loving God, and you don't want us just to take it because you said so. You want us to take it because we understand it and want to. So bless this new group tonight. Thank you for the weekend coming up, Friday, tomorrow, and the different activities. We continue to lift our brother Mike Tomberlin, bless his life and his family. And thank you for the love that you show to each of us and the families we represent and the people that we love. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.